I am Paige, 33 years old, and until today, I thought I had the perfect life. But standing behind a cold marble pillar at JFK International Airport, my reality shattered. I watched my husband holding my younger sister tight in his arms at the departure gate. They were laughing and clinking champagne glasses. I held my breath as I heard her say the plan worked perfectly, and that fool is going to lose everything today. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just smiled because they had no idea I was holding a piece of information that would guarantee their absolute ruin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your intelligence and your worth. The fluorescent lights of Terminal 4 hummed above me, casting a sterile glow over the bustling crowds of travelers. Gate D4 was supposed to be the gateway to a corporate networking retreat for my husband Derek, who is 35. At least that was the lie he told me when he kissed my cheek this morning and walked out the door with his designer luggage. I am the founder of a highly successful luxury interior design firm. I built my company from a tiny leased desk in a shared workspace into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that curates homes for the elite. I am used to dealing with high-pressure negotiations and demanding clients, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight unfolding 20 feet away. My younger sister Courtney, who is 31, was draped over Derek wearing a silk blouse I bought for her birthday last month. Her perfectly manicured hand rested on his chest, while her other hand balanced a crystal flute of expensive champagne they had purchased from the terminal lounge. I pressed my back against the cool structural pillar of the concourse, making sure I remained completely out of their line of sight. My chest felt tight, as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the airport, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. The chaotic noise of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements faded into the background as I tuned into their conversation. Courtney tossed her hair back and laughed, a sound that used to bring me joy, but now sounded like nails on a chalkboard. She leaned closer to Derek and kissed him deeply right out in the open. When they pulled apart, I heard her voice crystal clear. She told him that forging my signature on the asset transfer documents was the easiest thing she had ever done in her life. She sneered about how stupid I was for trusting her with the administrative access to my personal portfolio. Derek chuckled and pulled her closer, praising her for being so clever. He told her that by the time my plane landed for a design conference I was supposed to attend tomorrow, my bank accounts would be entirely drained and the commercial lease for my design firm would be legally transferred into their new offshore holding company. They were not just having an affair. They were systematically dismantling everything I had bled for over the last decade. They wanted to leave me absolutely destitute. A younger version of myself would have collapsed right there on the terminal floor. A weaker version of myself would have run over to them screaming and crying, demanding to know why my own flesh and blood would conspire with the man I vowed to spend my life with to destroy me. But I did not feel sorrow. As I listened to them gleefully discuss how I would have to declare bankruptcy and move into a tiny apartment, a profound freezing numbness washed over my entire body. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from my lead corporate attorney. The message simply read, "The merger is fully finalized and the financial trap is set. You have the green light." I locked my phone and slid it back into my tailored blazer. I took one deep breath, inhaling the stale airport air, and exhaled every ounce of love I ever held for the two people standing near the boarding desk. The time for hiding was over. I stepped out from behind the marble pillar and walked directly toward them. I did not rush. I took slow, deliberate steps, my designer heels clicking sharply against the polished terrazzo floor. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the terminal. Derek was in the middle of taking a sip of his champagne when he finally noticed the movement in his peripheral vision. He turned his head, and his eyes locked onto mine. The color drained from his face so fast he looked completely ghostly. His hand trembled, and his fingers lost their grip. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his hand and hit the floor, shattering into 100 pieces. The loud crash echoed around the gate, drawing the attention of several nearby passengers. Courtney jumped at the sound of the breaking glass. She spun around to scold him, but the words died in her throat the second she saw me standing less than 5 feet away. She froze in absolute terror, her eyes wide and her mouth hanging open in shock. "Hello, Derek," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "Hello, Courtney. Are you two excited for your first-class flight to the Maldives? I hear the water is exceptionally beautiful this time of year." For an agonizing 10 seconds, neither of them could speak. They just stared at me like I was a ghost who had come to drag them straight down to the underworld. Derek was the first to snap out of his paralyzed state. Instead of apologizing or showing an ounce of remorse, his face twisted into an ugly defensive scowl. The cowardice in him immediately morphed into aggressive gaslighting. He stepped over the shattered glass and pointed a finger at me. "What are you doing here, Paige?" he demanded, his voice rising defensively. "Are you having me followed? You are crazy. You forced me into this. You forced me to find comfort somewhere else. You are always at the office obsessing over your stupid fabric swatches and lighting fixtures. You love that business more than you ever loved me, so do not stand there and act like you are the victim here." He was trying to use my dedication and my success as a weapon against me, right in the middle of a crowded airport terminal. He wanted to make a scene, hoping I would shrink back out of embarrassment. He wanted me to cry so he could feel powerful. But I just stood there looking at him like he was a pathetic stranger. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I just offered him a chilling, perfectly composed smile. Courtney, having recovered from her initial shock, decided to lean into her lifelong role as the golden child. She puffed out her chest and stepped up next to Derek, grabbing his arm possessively. She looked me up and down with pure disdain, trying to project a confidence she clearly did not feel. She told me I was making a fool of myself and that I should just turn around and go back to my empty house before I embarrassed myself further. She actually had the audacity to tell me that Mom and Dad always knew I was incapable of keeping a man happy because I was too cold and calculating. Her words were meant to cut me deep, to trigger the childhood insecurities she had planted in my mind for years. But her psychological warfare meant nothing to me anymore. I looked at the two of them, clutching each other, surrounded by broken glass and spilled champagne. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had stolen my fortune and my future. They had absolutely no idea the magnitude of the mistake they had just made. Courtney took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of the silk blouse I had purchased for her. I watched the initial panic drain from her face, replaced by the familiar, arrogant smirk she had worn since childhood. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our family, and she knew it. She stepped forward, closing the distance between us, until she was close enough for me to smell her expensive perfume. "You always had to ruin everything, did you not, Paige?" she said, shaking her head with an exaggerated sigh. "You just could not let Derek and me have our moment of happiness." She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. She slapped the folder against her palm, a mocking rhythm that echoed slightly in the tense air between us. "Do you want to know what this is?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is the official transfer of ownership for your beloved design firm." She flipped the folder open and shoved the top page toward my face, pointing to a signature at the bottom. "It looks exactly like your handwriting, does it not? It is amazing what a little practice and a trusted notary can accomplish when you are too busy picking out curtain fabrics to pay attention to your own legal documents." "You are pathetic," Paige Courtney continued, her voice rising slightly so the nearby passengers could hear her. "Mom and Dad always knew you would end up alone. They warned Derek before you even got married. They told him you were a cold, unlovable workaholic who cared more about profit margins than building a real family. Do you honestly think anyone is surprised that my husband came to me for actual warmth and affection?" Derek stood right behind her, nodding in agreement, his chest puffed out now that Courtney had taken the lead. He wrapped an arm around her waist, a sickening display of solidarity. "She is right, Paige," he muttered, avoiding my direct gaze but trying to sound authoritative. "You were never present. You gave your soul to that company and you left me with nothing. So I took what I deserved. We took what we deserved. Courtney laughed again, that high-pitched grating sound. She tapped the forged paperwork with her perfectly manicured fingernail. You see, big sister, I am just taking out the trash. You have always been so obsessed with being the smartest person in the room, but you never actually see what is happening right under your nose. Mom always said you were too arrogant for your own good. She actually helped me pack my bags this morning. She told me to have a wonderful time in the Maldives, and that she would handle boxing up your things when the bank comes to foreclose on the house tomorrow. I did not flinch at the mention of our parents. Courtney saw my blank expression and it infuriated her. She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to beg. So she pushed harder, digging into decades of unresolved resentment. This is just like high school, she sneered, stepping even closer. Do you remember senior year when you were dating the captain of the lacrosse team? You thought he loved you because you helped him pass his calculus exams. But the second I showed up at the homecoming bonfire, he did not even look at you again. I took him from you in 5 minutes because I am the one people actually want. And what about your college graduation? You worked so hard to graduate summa cum laude, but Mom and Dad skipped your valedictorian speech to help me move into my luxury sorority house. You have always been the stepping stone, Paige. You build the foundation, and I get to live in the mansion. That is how the world works. You are just the workhorse. I am the prize. Derek stepped forward, cutting off her monologue with a smug grin of his own. He pointed toward the exit doors of the terminal. Look, the show is over, Paige. We have a flight to catch. You need to turn around, walk out of those sliding doors, and figure out where you are going to sleep tonight. I emptied our joint checking account yesterday afternoon and transferred every single dollar into a private offshore trust that you cannot touch. I even canceled the credit cards in your name. You have absolutely nothing left. Not your business, not your money, and certainly not me. Go home to your empty foreclosed apartment and pack whatever cheap clothes you have left before the locks are changed. You lost. Just accept it and walk away. I let his words hang in the air for a moment. I looked at the two of them standing there so proud and so entirely clueless. I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen to bring up my corporate banking dashboard. I tilted my head and offered them a smile so cold it could have frozen the champagne soaking into the carpet. You are right about one thing, Derek, I said softly. I did spend a lot of time working. But what you failed to realize is that my work taught me how to read the fine print. You see those boarding passes you are clutching so tightly in your hand, the ones that cost $12,000 apiece. You bought them yesterday morning using the corporate travel card linked directly to my firm. Courtney frowned, looking down at the tickets in her hand. So, what, she snapped defensively. It is our company now. We can use the corporate card however we want. I slowly shook my head. No, Courtney, you really cannot. Because I reported that specific corporate credit card stolen to the fraud department exactly 3 hours ago. I also flagged the transaction for the 2 first-class tickets to the Maldives as unauthorized and highly fraudulent. Furthermore, I alerted the airline security that the individuals attempting to board the flight using those stolen credentials were not authorized personnel of my corporation. Derek felt his face go pale once again. He looked down at the tickets and then back up at me, his jaw going slack. You are bluffing, he stammered. Right on cue, the harsh crackle of the public address system echoed through the terminal, cutting over the low murmur of the crowd. Attention passengers for Flight 892 to Mail. The gate agent announced, her voice echoing loudly across the concourse. We have a security flag on 2 tickets. Will passenger Derek and passenger Courtney please step up to the boarding desk immediately? Please bring your government-issued identification and the credit card used for this purchase. Airport security and the fraud prevention team need to speak with you before you are cleared to enter the aircraft. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked at my sister, whose hands were now shaking so violently the forged transfer folder slipped from her grasp and hit the floor. Boarding is calling, little sister, I whispered. You should probably go see what they want right now. The color completely vanished from Courtney's face as the gate agent's voice echoed through the terminal, once again repeating the demand for her and Derek to step up to the desk. The sheer arrogance that had puffed up her chest just seconds prior evaporated instantly, leaving behind nothing but raw, unadulterated panic. She looked at the forged transfer documents scattered on the floor and then stared at the stolen boarding passes trembling in her hand. Derek was entirely useless in this moment. He stood there paralyzed, his eyes darting frantically between me and the security personnel who were now slowly making their way toward our section of the gate. He muttered something under his breath, but the words were completely incoherent. Courtney, realizing that her supposed protector was falling apart right in front of her, let out a sharp, frustrated gasp. She frantically dug into her oversized designer tote bag, tossing her expensive makeup and travel accessories onto the carpet until her fingers wrapped around her phone. Her hands were shaking so violently that it took her 3 attempts to unlock the screen. I stood there perfectly still, watching her desperately swipe through her contacts. I knew exactly who she was calling. She was calling her husband, Terrence. Terrence is 34 years old and an incredibly wealthy African-American investment banker who commands a massive portfolio at a top-tier firm. He was the man who funded her lavish lifestyle, and more importantly, he was the man who dropped them off at the airport this morning, under the complete delusion that his wife was going on a corporate business trip with my husband. Because the airport traffic was notoriously terrible on Friday mornings, I calculated that Terrence would likely still be in the international departures terminal, grabbing his daily espresso before heading into the city for work. My calculation was absolutely correct. Less than 5 minutes after Courtney made her frantic, tear-filled phone call, I saw him cutting through the crowd of travelers. Terrence was an imposing figure who always commanded attention whenever he entered a room. He was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored navy blue suit, with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie that probably cost more than most people make in a week. His leather dress shoes clicked aggressively against the floor as he pushed past a family of tourists, completely ignoring their annoyed protests. He had a Bluetooth earpiece in one ear, and his face was set in a deep scowl. When Courtney saw him approaching, she immediately shifted gears into her favorite role. She transformed from a malicious conspirator into a helpless victim in the blink of an eye. She let out a loud theatrical sob and threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his expensive suit jacket. Terrence wrapped his arms around her, glaring over her shoulder directly at me. He patted her back and whispered something in her ear before stepping in front of her, completely shielding her from my view. Derek quickly shuffled behind Terrence as well, eager to hide behind a man who actually possessed a spine. Terrence did not bother to ask me what happened. He did not ask why the airport police were circling the boarding gate or why Derek was sweating profusely. He simply looked at me with a mixture of pity and profound irritation. He took 2 large steps forward, completely invading my personal space. He stood so close that I could smell his strong, musky cologne and the espresso on his breath. He looked down at me, using his height and his broad shoulders to physically intimidate me. This was a classic tactic he used in corporate boardrooms to force smaller competitors into submission. "Paige, you need to calm down right now." He ordered, his voice a deep, rumbling baritone that was meant to project absolute authority. "You are making a massive scene in a public place, and frankly, it is embarrassing to watch." Courtney called me completely hysterical, saying you are harassing them and making wild accusations about credit card theft. Look, I know you are emotional right now. I know finding out about Derek and Courtney is a difficult pill for you to swallow. But throwing a hysterical temper tantrum at an airport and lying to airline security just because your feelings are hurt is pathetic even for you. You need to act like an adult and walk away before I have to call my personal legal team to deal with your harassment. I maintained my composure, looking directly into his eyes without backing up a single inch. My silence seemed to infuriate him even more because he was entirely unaccustomed to women refusing to shrink in his presence. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh and adjusted his silk tie. "You always were out of your depth, Paige," he sneered, shaking his head. "You run a cute little interior design startup, and suddenly you think you understand how the real world works. You think you can just freeze a corporate account and stop a legal asset transfer. Let me educate you since you clearly do not understand basic high-level finance. The documents Courtney signed this morning are ironclad. The holding company we established is registered in a sovereign offshore jurisdiction that does not recognize your petty local injunctions. We utilized a complex series of shell corporations and blind trusts to insulate the asset transition. By the time your amateur strip mall lawyers even figure out how to file a motion of discovery, the capital will have been legally dispersed through 3 different international banking institutions. You cannot touch them, and you certainly cannot touch me. I engineered this entire restructuring myself. Terence was fully energized now, reveling in his own perceived brilliance. He began using heavy financial jargon specifically designed to make me feel small and uneducated. He talked about equity liquidation, capital gains shielding, and aggressive corporate restructuring, as if he were delivering a keynote speech at a Wall Street conference rather than standing in the middle of Terminal 4. He pointed a finger right at my face, emphasizing every single word. You are dealing with apex predators now, Paige. I move millions of dollars before I even finish my morning coffee. I have teams of corporate sharks who specialize in dismantling failing businesses like yours. You thought you were so smart building your little brand, but you failed to protect your liquid assets. Derek came to me because he realized his wife was a terrible investment. He wanted out, and I showed him the door. I provided the financial architecture to secure his future with my wife. So you can stand here and try to play the victim all you want, but the reality is, you lost. The market always corrects itself, and you have just been liquidated. If you do not turn around and walk out of this airport right now, I will personally make sure you never secure another line of credit or business loan in your entire life. I stood completely still, committing every single detail of his arrogant public confession to memory before I finally began to smile brightly. Terence stood there adjusting his silk tie, looking down at me as if I were dirt on his leather shoes. He was intoxicated by his perceived brilliance. I saw the reflection of the terminal lights in his watch as he crossed his arms. He believed that because he wore a tailored suit, he was untouchable. But what Terence failed to realize in his arrogance was that we were not standing in the privacy of his corner office. We were in the middle of Terminal 4, at one of the busiest airports in the world. Above his head, mounted to the ceiling, was a high-definition security camera recording every movement. To my left, a family had stopped walking, and the teenage daughter was holding her phone up, recording the altercation. The gate agent who called Derek and Courtney to the desk was leaning over her podium, listening intently to Terence. He was so busy trying to assert his dominance over a woman he viewed as inferior that he was publicly broadcasting a confession to a federal crime. I did not interrupt him. I knew the best way to destroy a narcissist is to simply hand them a shovel and let them dig. I tilted my head slightly and let out a soft sigh as if I were finally conceding defeat. "So you are the one who did it?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady, playing the part of the confused and defeated wife. Derek is barely smart enough to balance a basic checking account, so I knew he could not have orchestrated a massive asset transfer on his own. "You really set up the entire offshore holding company, Terence." Terence let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed across the boarding area. He looked at Derek and shook his head in disbelief before looking back down at me. "Of course I set it up, Paige," he bragged, his voice echoing loudly. "Derek came crying to me 2 months ago, complaining that he was tired of playing second fiddle to your little interior design hobby. You really think a guy like Derek knows the first thing about international corporate law or tax evasion? I am a senior vice president of investment banking. I move more capital before breakfast than your entire company generates in a fiscal year. You are just a failed startup. Nobody who got lucky with a few wealthy clients. You do not understand how real money works." He took another step forward, entirely eager to prove his intellectual superiority. "I was the one who structured the primary offshore limited liability company in the Cayman Islands," he continued, his voice dripping with absolute smugness. "I personally drafted the articles of incorporation and layered them behind 3 different blind trusts in Panama. I showed Derek exactly which legal loopholes to exploit so he could drain your business accounts without triggering an automatic audit from the Internal Revenue Service. We moved the capital and microtransactions just under the federal reporting threshold over the course of 4 weeks, so your bank would not flag the withdrawals. By the time we initiated the final bulk transfer yesterday, your company was completely hollowed out. I stripped your agency of every single liquid asset it had, and I did it flawlessly. Courtney was practically glowing with pride as she listened to her husband boast. She leaned her head against his shoulder and sneered at me. "You see, Paige?" she chimed in, her tone dripping with venom. "Terrence is a real man. He takes care of his family, and he makes sure we get exactly what we deserve. You spent your whole life trying to prove you were smarter than everyone else, but you got completely outplayed." Derek, emboldened by Terrence's aggressive monologue, stepped out from behind his shadow and pointed a finger at me. "Terrence is a genius, Paige," Derek added, his voice trembling slightly with residual adrenaline. "He protected me from you. He made sure that when I finally left you, I would not walk away empty-handed. We secured the commercial lease, we secured the cash reserves, and we secured my future with Courtney. There is no paper trail that leads back to us." I looked at Derek and then back at Terrence. It was truly magnificent to watch them unravel themselves. Terrence was a licensed financial professional, a man legally bound by strict federal regulations and fiduciary duties. Yet here he was, standing in a crowded airport surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, boldly admitting to conspiracy, wire fraud, and the deliberate circumvention of federal tax laws. He thought his wealth made him immune to consequences. "You really thought of everything, Terrence," I said, keeping my facial expression completely neutral. "You layered the trusts, you structured the microtransactions, and you bypassed the reporting thresholds. That takes a very specific set of skills. It must have taken you weeks to orchestrate such a complex financial maneuver using your personal banking credentials." Terrence smirked proudly, adjusting his expensive lapels. "It took me less than 3 days, Paige. That is the difference between a professional and an amateur. I know the banking system inside and out. I know exactly how to manipulate the compliance algorithms so nobody even looks twice at the transfer protocols. I used my private terminal at the bank to route the funds through a secondary clearinghouse before they hit the offshore accounts. It was untraceable. You could hire a dozen forensic accountants, and they would spend years chasing ghost accounts while we sit on a beach sipping expensive cocktails. You have zero leverage here. You are completely bankrupt. The only thing you have left is a pile of legal fees you will never be able to afford." I let his words wash over me, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his public confession. He had just admitted to using his employer's private banking terminal to commit international wire fraud. He had essentially handed me a signed confession tied up with a neat little bow. The airport security officers who had been slowly approaching our gate were now standing just 10 feet away, listening to the tail end of his arrogant speech. 2 Transportation Security Administration agents had also stopped to observe the commotion. Terrence was so fixated on watching me that he failed to notice the audience closing in around us. He thought he was delivering the final crushing blow to a defeated woman. He thought he had won the war and secured his wife's happiness at my expense. He had absolutely no idea that every single word out of his mouth guaranteed him a stay in a federal penitentiary. I did not need to hire forensic accountants. I did not need to chase ghost accounts across international borders. Because Terrence, in all his infinite corporate wisdom, had just stolen $4 million from the absolute worst people imaginable. And I was about to introduce him to the real apex predators. I allowed Terrence to savor his moment of perceived victory. He stood there with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily after his long-winded explanation of his own financial crimes. He looked at me with an expression of pure superiority, fully expecting me to burst into tears or beg for my company back. Courtney was practically vibrating with joy, clinging to his arm like he was a conquering hero who had just returned from a victorious battle. Derek had even managed to find his spine again, standing a little taller, now that Terrence had supposedly put me in my place. The terminal around us was still buzzing with travelers checking their boarding passes and buying overpriced coffees, but in our small circle, the air was thick with the toxic arrogance of three people who genuinely thought they had just ruined my life. I did not give them the satisfaction of a panicked reaction. I did not raise my voice, and I did not flinch. I simply let the silence stretch out between us. I wanted Terence to hear his own words echoing in his mind. I wanted him to remember every single detail of the massive confession he had just broadcasted to the entire airport terminal. When I finally moved, I did not rush. I slowly unclasped my designer leather handbag and reached inside. My fingers brushed past my wallet and my keys until they found the crisp manila envelope I had placed there earlier this morning. I pulled it out, holding it delicately between my fingers. Terence rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh of pure annoyance. "What is that, Paige?" he asked, his tone dripping with absolute boredom and condescension. "Are you going to show me some meaningless cease and desist letter from your cheap local lawyer? I told you already that your petty injunctions do not mean anything in the international jurisdictions I set up. You are wasting your time and you are wasting my time. We have a flight to catch, and you have a foreclosed apartment to pack up." I did not say a word in response to his taunts. I simply opened the flap of the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a formal corporate filing. It was heavily redacted in certain sections with thick black ink to protect confidential trade secrets, but the most important and devastating parts were left completely visible. The official state seal was stamped prominently at the top, and the signatures at the bottom were notarized by a federal judge. I held the paper out toward him, my arm perfectly steady. Terence looked at the document and then looked at me, a smug smirk still playing on his lips. He snatched the paper out of my hand with a quick, aggressive motion, clearly intending to glance at it, scoff at its contents, and throw it right back in my face. But that is exactly what did not happen. I watched his eyes track the first few lines of text at the top of the page. I watched the confident, arrogant smirk slowly freeze and then completely melt off his face. The physical transformation was absolute and immediate. The aggressive, intimidating posture he had maintained for the last 10 minutes completely collapsed in on itself. His broad shoulders slumped forward as if an invisible weight had just been dropped on his back. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin looking pale and clammy under the bright fluorescent terminal lights. His eyes widened slightly as they darted back and forth across the page, reading the same paragraphs over and over again, as if his highly educated brain was completely refusing to process the terrifying information in front of him. Courtney noticed the drastic change in her husband immediately. She let go of his arm and took a step back, her own malicious smile faltering. "Terence," she asked, her voice trembling slightly with sudden uncertainty. "What is it? What does that piece of paper say? Tell her it means absolutely nothing so we can leave." Terence did not answer her. He could not answer her. He was too busy staring at the bold watermark of the billion-dollar private equity firm that now legally owned my former company. He was looking at the exact dates and the federal filing numbers that proved his perfect financial crime was actually a perfectly orchestrated trap. "Since you are a senior vice president of investment banking, Terence," I began, my voice smooth, perfectly polite, and entirely conversational. "I am sure you recognize an official merger and acquisition filing when you see one. You see, you were right about one thing a moment ago. I am just an interior designer. I am not a financial wizard, and I certainly do not know how to bypass international banking regulations or set up offshore shell companies. But I do know how to protect my assets, and I absolutely know how to hire corporate attorneys who are much smarter and much more ruthless than you." Terence swallowed hard. The thick piece of paper in his hand was visibly shaking now, rustling slightly in the quiet space between us. "You told Derek you were a genius for creating those offshore accounts." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, so I was standing right in his face, forcing him to look at me. "You bragged about moving my money in microtransactions so you would not trigger an automatic tax audit. But you made one massive, fatal miscalculation, Terence. You assumed that the money you were stealing still belonged to me. It did not. Exactly 1 week ago, I legally dissolved my original agency. I completely liquidated my ownership stake and merged my entire design portfolio into a massive new corporate entity. I sold the brand name, the exclusive client list, the commercial leases, and every single liquid asset to a massive global private equity firm called Apex Holdings. Derek let out a loud, dramatic gasp from behind Terrence. What he stammered, taking a clumsy step backward and nearly tripping over his own designer luggage. What do you mean you sold it? We transferred the money yesterday afternoon. The corporate accounts were completely full. I checked the balances myself before I initiated the wire transfers. I turned my gaze to my soon-to-be ex-husband, looking at him with nothing but pure pity. The accounts were full, Derek, because Apex Holdings had just deposited their initial operating capital into the corporate treasury to fund our new European expansion project. That was not my personal money you took. It was their corporate capital. I knew you were planning to drain the accounts for months. My lawyers found the offshore shell companies Terrence set up over a month ago. We saw exactly what you were trying to do, and we monitored every single fake account you opened. So instead of blocking the transfer and fighting you in divorce court, I laid a trap. I let you think you were stealing my life savings, but I had already stepped completely out of the way. I left the vault door wide open for you, and you walked right in, blindfolded. I turned back to Terrence, whose breathing had become incredibly shallow and rapid. He was staring at the paper like it was a federal death warrant because his extensive financial background told him that it essentially was. Apex Holdings is not a cute little boutique startup, Terrence, I said, keeping my tone incredibly polite and purely transactional, as if I were explaining a fabric choice to a client. They are a ruthless global financial conglomerate. They manage over $80 billion in international assets. They have an entire floor of vicious corporate litigators whose only job is to financially destroy people who mess with their money. And yesterday afternoon, you and Derek used your personal banking credentials to illegally wire $4 million of their corporate funds into an unauthorized offshore account. Terrence opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just let out a weak, ragged breath. The heavy financial jargon he had used to intimidate me just moments ago was completely gone. He was stripped down to nothing but a terrified, desperate man holding a piece of paper that proved he had just destroyed his own lucrative career and his entire life. You did not commit simple marital asset theft against a scorned wife, I explained, speaking slowly and clearly, so there would be no misunderstanding the gravity of their situation. You committed federal wire fraud against a billion-dollar corporation. You forged the signature of an Apex Holdings executive on those transfer documents, which constitutes corporate espionage and felony forgery. You utilized your employer's private banking terminal to facilitate the theft, which means you also violated the Patriot Act and multiple strict international banking treaties. The forged documents you had Courtney sign this morning did not transfer ownership of my company to you. They legally transferred the full liability of your federal crimes directly into your own laps. The power dynamic in the terminal completely inverted in that exact moment. Terrence, the supposed apex predator, the man who proudly claimed he moved millions before breakfast, looked like he was about to physically collapse onto the airport floor. He dropped the paper. It fluttered down, landing right next to the shattered crystal champagne glass. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He knew the paperwork was entirely authentic. He recognized the federal regulatory seals and the corporate watermarks. He knew that the legal trap I had laid was absolutely inescapable. You did this on purpose, he whispered, his voice trembling and barely audible over the terminal announcements. You knew we were going to take the money, and you set us up to take the fall. I smiled brightly, adjusting the strap of my designer handbag on my shoulder. I am a business owner, Terrence. I simply saw a hostile takeover attempting to form, and I executed a strategic corporate pivot. You wanted to play high-level finance with the big sharks. Well, congratulations, Terrence. You are in the deep water now, and there is blood everywhere. I hope you brought your legal team to the airport today because you are really going to need them. I watched Terrence stare at the floor of the terminal as if it were about to open up and swallow him whole. The piece of paper he had just dropped seemed to radiate a toxic energy, and neither Derek nor Courtney dared to pick it up. You see, Terrence, I began, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. You assumed that my company was still just a successful little startup. You assumed that the $4 million sitting in the primary operating account was the accumulated profit from my interior design contracts over the last few years. But if you had actually done your due diligence instead of rushing to steal from your sister-in-law, you would have noticed a massive discrepancy. My business never carried $4 million in liquid cash. We always reinvested our profits into real estate and high-end inventory. That money was deposited exactly 48 hours ago by the Treasury Department of Apex Holdings. It was the initial operational budget allocated specifically for our new international expansion. When you routed those funds out of the account yesterday afternoon, you did not steal my life savings. You reached directly into the pocket of a global financial conglomerate and you robbed them blind. Terrence was breathing so heavily I could see his chest heaving under his custom-tailored suit jacket. He took a shaky step backward, putting some distance between us. His eyes were wide with a terror that only a man who truly understands the legal system can experience. Derek looked completely lost, his eyes darting between me and Terrence. "What does that mean?" Derek asked, his voice cracking with panic. "Terrence, you said this was foolproof. You said we were just taking her money and she would never be able to trace it." I did not let Terrence answer him. I took a step forward, maintaining my absolute control over the situation. "It means, Derek," I said, speaking to him as if he were a slow child, "that your brilliant brother-in-law just orchestrated a textbook violation of Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1343. That is the federal statute for wire fraud. Because you used electronic communications to cross state and international lines to defraud a corporate entity, you triggered an automatic federal jurisdiction. And because you stole from a massive private equity firm, you did not just trigger a local police report. You triggered an immediate response from their internal corporate espionage and fraud division. Apex Holdings has a proprietary cybersecurity system that tracks every single penny they invest. The second you initiated that wire transfer using your personal banking terminal, they flagged the transaction. They watched you route the money through the secondary clearinghouse. They watched you push it into the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. They let you complete the transaction so they could collect the digital fingerprints tying you directly to the crime. Courtney let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "But I only signed the papers," she cried out, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I just signed the transfer documents that Terrence gave me. I did not touch any computers. I did not transfer any money. Paige, you have to tell them I did not do the transfer." I turned my gaze to my sister, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, Courtney," I said softly, shaking my head. "You really should read things before you sign them. By forging my signature on those transfer documents yesterday morning, you did not just commit standard fraud. Because I no longer owned the company, you essentially forged the signature of an authorized Apex Holdings executive. You participated in a coordinated scheme to defraud a billion-dollar corporation and illegally acquire their corporate assets. That makes you an active co-conspirator in a massive federal crime. The holding company Terrence set up has your name on it, Courtney. You are listed as the primary beneficiary of the stolen funds. You are just as liable as the two men standing next to you." Terrence finally found his voice, but it was completely stripped of its previous arrogance. It sounded weak and hollow. "Paige," he whispered, holding his hands up in a desperate pleading gesture. "Please, you have to call them off. You have to call the executives at Apex and tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them it was a marital dispute over joint assets. I will reverse the wire transfer right now. I will pull the funds out of the offshore accounts and send every single penny back to their treasury by the end of the hour. Just tell them not to contact the authorities. I will lose my banking license. I will lose my career. I will go to federal prison. I looked at the man who had stood in this exact same spot just 10 minutes ago, bragging about how he was an apex predator. I looked at the man who had mocked my intelligence and threatened to destroy my financial future. Terrence. I replied, my tone completely conversational. I do not own the company anymore. I am simply an employee now. I serve as the creative director for the new division. I do not have the authority to call off a federal investigation, and even if I did have the authority, I would not make that phone call. Apex Holdings does not negotiate with thieves. They do not accept apologies, and they certainly do not care about your marital disputes. When they realized someone was trying to embezzle $4 million of their operational capital, they did not hesitate. Their legal team drafted the warrants last night. They have already submitted all the digital evidence, the IP addresses, the routing numbers, and the forged documents to the federal authorities. Derek fell to his knees right there in the middle of the terminal. The designer luggage he had packed for his romantic getaway to the Maldives tipped over, spilling onto the floor. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. He realized that the luxurious life he thought he had stolen was actually a one-way ticket to a prison cell. He had traded a loyal wife and a comfortable life for a guaranteed federal conviction, all because he was too greedy and too stupid to see the trap I had laid right in front of him. "You destroyed us!" Courtney screamed, stepping toward me with her fists clenched, her face red with absolute rage and terror. "You set this up to ruin our lives. You knew Terrence would use his banking credentials, and you knew I would sign the papers. You are a monster, Paige. You are a cold, calculating monster." I smiled warmly at my sister, completely unfazed by her hysterical accusations. "You are getting it backward, Courtney," I corrected her gently. "I did not force Derek to sleep with you. I did not force Terrence to use his corporate power to steal money. And I certainly did not force you to forge my name. I simply stepped out of the way and let the three of you destroy yourselves. You dug the hole, Terrence built the coffin, and Derek nailed it shut. I am just the person standing over the grave watching you fall in." Terrence knew the specific penalties for the statutes I had just recited. He knew that federal wire fraud carried a penalty of up to 20 years in prison for every single count. And because he had routed the money through 3 different international clearinghouses, he had technically committed 3 separate counts of wire fraud. That was 60 years of potential prison time hanging over his head, not to mention the heavy fines, the complete forfeiture of all his personal assets, and the permanent revocation of his prestigious financial licenses. He had spent his entire adult life building a reputation as a brilliant, untouchable titan of the financial industry. Now, he was going to be remembered as the arrogant fool who accidentally stole millions from a company that could buy and sell him before lunch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the device on the floor. It clattered against the terrazzo tiles right next to the broken champagne glass. He scrambled to pick it up, his perfectly pressed suit wrinkling in the process. He looked pathetic. He was frantically trying to open his banking application to check the status of the offshore accounts, hoping by some miracle he could reverse the transaction before the federal agents arrived. But I knew his accounts were already frozen. Apex Holdings had seen to that hours ago. The realization washed over him as he stared at the error messages on his glowing screen. The money was locked, the trap was sprung. The perfect crime was officially a permanent nightmare. The crushing reality of federal prison had effectively paralyzed the 2 men standing in front of me. Terrence was staring blankly at the floor as his lucrative career and his entire freedom evaporated into thin air. Derek was still kneeling on the carpet, weeping softly into his hands, a pathetic display of a man who finally understood the consequences of his own greed. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and for the first time in her pampered life, Courtney realized that the men she relied on to fight her battles had been entirely neutralized. But instead of accepting defeat and taking responsibility for her actions, my younger sister reverted to the only defense mechanism she had ever known. She reached for her ultimate safety net. Her hands trembling wildly, she grabbed her phone from the floor and aggressively tapped the screen to initiate a FaceTime video call with our parents. I stood perfectly still and watched her hold the phone up in front of her face. The connection went through almost instantly. The screen illuminated, displaying the bright sunny patio of the exclusive country club our parents frequented every Friday afternoon. Our mother Brenda appeared on the screen holding a tall glass of iced tea with a wedge of lemon resting on the rim. She was wearing a crisp white tennis outfit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her oversized designer sunglasses pushed up onto the top of her head. Before Courtney could even open her mouth to explain the catastrophic situation unfolding at the airport terminal, Brenda caught a glimpse of me standing in the background over Courtney's shoulder. Her relaxed country club demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp scowl of deep annoyance. "Paige, what on earth are you doing there?" Brenda snapped, her voice loud and shrill, echoing clearly from the phone speaker across the quiet boarding area. "I told you specifically to stay away from the airport today. Are you really so bitter and jealous that you had to track them down just to ruin your sister's vacation? You are making an absolute fool of yourself. Go home right now and leave them alone." She did not ask why Terrence looked like he was about to pass out. She did not ask why Derek was crying on the floor surrounded by his spilled luggage. She did not even ask why there were airport security officers standing just a few yards away observing our group. Her golden child was upset, and therefore I was automatically the villain. It was the exact same toxic dynamic I had endured for my entire life, playing out in high-definition video. "Mom, you have to help us," Courtney wailed, sobbing loudly into the phone. "Paige did something to the bank accounts. She tricked us. The money is not hers, and now Terrence is saying we are going to be arrested. Tell her to fix it, Mom. Tell her she has to fix it right now." Instead of showing concern or asking for logical details, Brenda rolled her eyes and let out a loud, exasperated sigh. She took a delicate sip of her iced tea and glared directly into the camera lens, aiming her absolute disdain entirely at me. "Paige, stop this ridiculous temper tantrum immediately," she ordered, her tone dripping with the condescension of a parent scolding a disobedient toddler. "You are behaving like a selfish child. Did you honestly think we were not going to find out about your little bank accounts? Did you really think you could just hoard all that money for yourself while your own sister struggles to pay her mortgage?" I did not interrupt her. I let the silence stretch, ensuring that her voice carried clearly to everyone standing nearby. "You brought this entirely on yourself, Paige." Brenda continued, leaning closer to her phone screen, her face twisting with malice. "You have been a terrible wife to Derek for years. You are cold, you are unfeeling, and you care more about your stupid design clients than you do about your own family. You left that poor man starving for affection. Do you know how much pain he was when he came to me crying because his wife refused to put her business aside to start a family?" Of course he turned to Courtney. Courtney actually knows how to love someone. Courtney actually has a warm heart. I gave them my blessing months ago. I told them they belonged together. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the stale airport air. A woman standing at the ticketing counter a few feet away actually gasped out loud, dropping her boarding pass. But Brenda was completely unbothered by the fact that she was publicly endorsing her daughter's affair with my husband. In her narcissistic reality, I was the one who had failed. I was the one who deserved to be punished. And as for the money, Brenda scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively, "You owed that to them. You made millions of dollars playing with fabric swatches while your sister had to settle for a basic townhouse. That is not fair, and you know it. We raised you to share with your sister. Derek and Courtney deserve a fresh start, and they deserve to be comfortable. Taking your business assets was simply collecting the compensation you owed Derek for wasting the best years of his life. Terrence is a brilliant financial mind. He made sure the transfer was done properly so you could not hoard your wealth anymore. You should be apologizing to them for making this transition so difficult. Now pick up Derek's bags, apologize to your sister, and walk out of that airport before you embarrass this family any further." I looked at the screen, watching my mother casually justify infidelity embezzlement and the total destruction of my life, all between sips of her country club iced tea. She truly believed that because I was successful, I was obligated to fund the lives of the people who betrayed me. She believed that my pain was completely irrelevant as long as her golden child was happy. She had just admitted to having premeditated knowledge of the affair and the financial drain, entirely confirming that my entire family had conspired against me. I did not yell. I did. I did not cry. I simply smiled at the phone. I knew that every single horrific word she had just spoken was being absorbed by the security agents who were now stepping into the boarding area. She had just verbally cemented the motive for the crime and implicated herself as an accessory to the conspiracy, all without me having to say a single word. She had handed me the final nail for their collective coffin. Before Brenda could finish her toxic rant, the camera suddenly jolted. The view of the country club patio was instantly replaced by the red, furious face of my father Richard. He had snatched the phone from my mother's hands. His thick eyebrows were drawn together, and a vein throbbed at his temple. My father ruled our family with an iron fist. He demanded absolute obedience from everyone under his roof. He never cared about emotional nuances, he only cared about control and getting his way. Paige, listen to me very carefully, he growled. I do not care about who slept with who. I do not care about your hurt feelings. And I do not care about whatever trap you think you sprung on your sister. You are going to fix this mess right now. I stood my ground looking at the man who was supposed to protect me. He was openly commanding me to fall on my sword for the people who had just tried to destroy my life. My entire focus was locked on that glowing screen. You are going to take your phone out right now, Richard ordered, pointing a finger at the camera lens. You are going to call the executives at Apex Holdings and tell them you made a massive administrative error. You will tell them you authorized Derek and Terrence to move that money and that the forged signatures were just a miscommunication. You are going to take the full blame for this wire fraud, Paige. You will tell those federal agents to stand down and let your sister and brother-in-law get on that plane today. I stared at the screen, letting the absurdity of his demands sink in. He was ordering me to confess to a federal crime I did not commit. He wanted me to hand myself over to a corporate fraud investigation. He was asking me to risk decades in prison just so Courtney could sip cocktails on a tropical beach with my cheating husband. It was the ultimate display of the golden child dynamic. My life, my freedom, and my reputation were completely disposable to him as long as it kept his favorite daughter from experiencing discomfort. Dad, I said, keeping my voice completely steady. They committed felony wire fraud. They stole $4 million from a billion-dollar corporation. I cannot just call a customer service hotline and say I made a mistake. That is not how federal law works, and Terrence knows that. Do not use that tone with me, he shouted, spit flying from his lips. You are tearing this family apart, Paige. You have always been vindictive and jealous of your sister because she knows how to keep a family together. Terrence is a highly respected investment banker. He manages my personal portfolios. If he goes down for this, it ruins our entire family reputation. It ruins my legacy. I will not allow you to destroy my family name just because you could not keep your own husband satisfied at home. The emotional blackmail was suffocating. For 33 years, I had been conditioned to seek his approval, to make him proud. He knew exactly which psychological buttons to push, to make me feel small and obligated. He was weaponizing my lifelong desire for a loving family against me. He was pushing me to the absolute brink of family obligation versus self-preservation. You owe us, Paige. Richard continued, his face growing even redder. We gave you everything. We paid for your private schools and your college tuition. We gave you the foundation to build that stupid design business of yours. And this is how you repay us. By sending your own flesh and blood to a federal prison. You are a disgrace to this family. He paused, taking a deep breath to deliver his final blow. He truly believed this was the ultimate trump card. He believed that holding his immense personal wealth over my head would easily force me into immediate submission. "If you do not call that company right now and take the blame, I am done with you," he threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "I will completely disown you, Paige. You will be banished from this family. You will not be welcome at Thanksgiving or any family gathering ever again. I will forbid your aunts, uncles, and cousins from ever speaking your name. And more importantly, I will call my estate lawyer this afternoon and write you out of my will entirely. You know how much my estate is worth. It is a multi-million-dollar trust. I will leave every single penny to Courtney and Terrence, and I will leave you absolutely nothing. You will be dead to me." Terrence, Derek, and Courtney watched me expectantly. They saw my father drop his ultimate ultimatum right in front of them. They knew how much I craved my father's acceptance. They fully expected me to crack under the immense emotional pressure to lower my head cry and do exactly what I was told, just like when I was a scared little girl. They truly thought the threat of losing my family and my inheritance would be the heavy metal chain that dragged me down to the bottom of the ocean alongside them. I looked at my father's furious face on the screen. I looked at the three criminals standing silently in front of me. I felt the absolute brink of family obligation warring with my own self-preservation. For a fraction of a second, the little girl inside me mourned the protective father she never had. But the independent woman I had become, the business owner who had just outsmarted an investment banker and a cheating husband, felt nothing but pure liberation. Because my father had just played a hand of cards that I already knew was entirely fake. I let my father's vicious threat hang in the airport air. His face was pressed to the camera lens. He fully expected me to shatter into pieces right there in the terminal. He expected the grown woman standing in front of him to revert back to the terrified little girl who used to desperately beg for his scraps of affection. He thought the threat of losing his money would bring me to my knees. Instead of crying, I felt a genuine smile spread across my face. It was a loud, joyous laugh that bubbled up from the bottom of my chest and echoed through the boarding area. The sound confused the security officers and the passengers who had gathered to watch the drama unfold. On the screen, my father's face shifted instantly, from absolute rage to deep confusion. He blinked several times, not understanding why his weapon of emotional destruction had bounced harmlessly off my armor. "Are you laughing at me?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. "I am threatening to cut you out of this family forever, and you stand there laughing like a lunatic." "I am not laughing like a lunatic, Dad," I replied, keeping my tone incredibly conversational. "I am laughing because you are trying to hold a loaded weapon to my head, but I am the one who emptied the chamber weeks ago." I reached back into my designer leather handbag. My fingers bypassed the corporate merger files and wrapped around a second manila envelope. I had prepared a complete dossier for this exact moment. I pulled out a thick stack of financial documents and held them up to the camera so my father could see the bold red stamps of a national bank covering the top pages. When you run a successful corporate entity, you learn to conduct background checks on anyone who might pose a liability to your assets. When I suspected Derek was stealing from my company accounts, I hired a forensic investigator to look into his finances. But my investigator did not stop at Derek. He looked at everyone Derek was associated with. He looked at Terrence. He looked at Courtney. And inevitably, he looked at you and Mom. Brenda leaned into the frame next to Richard, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the patio table. "What are those papers?" she demanded, her voice completely losing its arrogant country club confidence. "What did you do, Paige?" I flipped to the second page of the packet, making sure the camera focused directly on the terrifying red numbers. "I am looking at the complete financial profile of your precious multi-million-dollar estate, Dad," I said, my voice ringing with authority. "You just threatened to write me out of your will to punish me for not protecting your golden child. But the absolute truth is you do not have an estate to leave behind. You are completely bankrupt. Richard went entirely pale on the screen. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. You spent the last 10 years trying to maintain the grand illusion of massive wealth. I continued reading directly from the bank summary. But your investment portfolio tanked years ago. To keep up appearances and to fund Courtney's ridiculously extravagant lifestyle, you took out a second mortgage on your primary residence. You took out high-interest personal loans to pay for her luxury wedding to Terrence. You drained your retirement accounts just to buy her that imported sports car so she could look wealthy in front of her friends. And now the bill has finally come due. You have missed your last 4 mortgage payments. The bank initiated the final foreclosure process 3 days ago. By next Friday, the sheriff is going to show up at your front door to physically evict you from that beautiful colonial house you love to brag about. The silence on the FaceTime call was absolutely deafening. The vibrant, sunny patio behind them suddenly looked like a pathetic stage set for a play that had just been canceled. You threatened to cut me out of a will that is mathematically worth negative $2 million, I stated, shaking my head in pure amusement. You cannot disown me from an empire of debt. You have nothing left to hold over my head. Mom is sitting there sipping iced tea, judging me for working hard while you two are secretly drowning in financial ruin. In fact, I am actually surprised the country club staff even let you sit on that patio today. According to the collections report, my investigator pulled your exclusive membership was suspended on Tuesday due to 6 months of unpaid dues. You are drinking stolen tea while you scream at me about family loyalty and responsibility. Courtney was staring at the phone screen, her eyes wide with sheer unadulterated terror. She spent her life believing our parents were an endless fountain of cash that would rescue her from her mistakes. Mom, she whispered softly, her voice trembling. Dad, is she telling the truth? Are you losing the house? Richard and Brenda just stared at the screen, their faces completely frozen in humiliated silence. They could not formulate a single lie to counter the thick stack of verified bank documents I was holding in my hand. The wealthy facade they used to terrorize and manipulate me for over 3 decades was instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the golden child they had ruined themselves to protect. The panic in their eyes matched Courtney's. Terrence let out a low, agonizing groan, realizing that the wealthy family he thought he had married into was actually a group of broke, desperate frauds. Derek remained on the floor too, defeated to even look up. The grand illusion of their superiority was completely obliterated. They were not apex predators. They were just a family of broke, desperate liars standing in the ashes of their own arrogant mistakes. The silence radiating from the phone screen was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. For 33 years, I had been conditioned to fear my father's booming voice and my mother's biting criticism. I had spent countless holidays biting my tongue and shrinking myself to fit into their tiny, distorted version of what a daughter should be. But looking at their frozen, humiliated faces through the FaceTime connection, I realized they possessed absolutely no real power over me. They were just 2 bitter, aging people sitting on a rented country club patio, staring down the barrel of their own massive financial ruin. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He opened his mouth, attempting to summon the booming, authoritative voice he had used to terrorize me since childhood, but the words simply failed to materialize. He was completely stripped of his financial leverage, and without his money, he was nothing more than a hollow shell of a man. I looked directly into the camera lens, ensuring that my eyes pierced right through his transparent bravado. "You do not get to disown me, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any familial affection. "You do not hold the keys to my life anymore, and honestly, you never really did. For years, I stayed quiet because I foolishly believed that if I was just successful enough, you would eventually love me the way you loved Courtney. I thought that if I built a great company and married a nice man, I would finally earn a seat at your table. But today you proved exactly what kind of people you really are. You willingly cheered as my husband and my sister conspired to steal everything I built. You endorsed their affair and you demanded that I go to federal prison just so your precious golden child would not have to face the consequences of her own horrific actions. I shifted my gaze on the screen to look directly at my mother. Brenda was shaking her perfectly styled hair, falling slightly out of place as her hands trembled. You always told me I was too cold and too focused on my career. Mom, I continued speaking softly but with absolute lethal precision. You told Derek he was justified in betraying our marriage because I was not warm enough for him. But the truth is, I was only cold to you because you never offered me a single drop of warmth. You spent my entire life comparing me to Courtney, telling me I was second best, telling me I was unlovable. You enabled her absolute entitlement. You funded her delusions of grandeur with money you did not even have. And now you get to watch her go down for federal wire fraud while you lose the very house you raised us in. I hope you enjoy the view from the street when the bank locks your doors next week. I hope you remember this exact conversation when you are packing your designer clothes into cheap cardboard boxes. Mom, please say something. Courtney begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. Tell her to help us right now. She took a desperate step toward me, reaching her trembling hand out toward the phone. She still genuinely believed that if she cried hard enough, our parents would magically step in and fix the situation just like they had done for her entire life. But this time, Brenda just looked down at the table, unable to meet her favorite daughter's pleading eyes. Richard turned his face away, staring off into the distance of the country club patio. The impenetrable protective bubble they had built around Courtney had finally violently burst, leaving her completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world. I am not taking the blame for your financial crimes, I stated, speaking clearly to all four of them at once, making sure my voice carried across the terminal. I am not calling the federal authorities to call off their investigation, and I am certainly not giving any of you a single dime of my money ever again. You chose this path. You wanted to operate like ruthless corporate criminals, so now you get to deal with the ruthless corporate consequences. As of this exact second, I do not have a father. I do not have a mother. And I absolutely do not have a sister. You are all completely dead to me. Have a wonderful life. Before Richard or Brenda could utter a single desperate word of protest, I moved my thumb across the screen and tapped the red button. The video feed instantly cut off, plunging the phone back to my silent home screen. But I did not stop there. I knew Courtney was watching my every single move. I wanted her to witness the absolute permanence of my decision. I opened my contact list and slowly scrolled down to my father's name. I tapped his contact icon and selected the option to permanently block the caller. I did the exact same thing for my mother. I deleted their contact cards from my phone, entirely erasing their phone numbers and their personal email accounts from my digital life. I wiped their entire existence away with 3 simple taps on a smooth glass screen. Courtney let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She watched the only safety net she had ever known completely vanish. She was not the untouchable golden child anymore. She was just a 31-year-old woman standing in an airport terminal surrounded by broken glass, stolen luggage, and 2 completely defeated men facing decades in a federal prison. There were no more lies to hide behind. There was no more stolen money to bail her out of trouble. And there was absolutely no family to catch her when she finally hit the concrete ground. I looked at her one last time, letting her see the complete and total absence of mercy in my eyes. I had spent my entire life being the family scapegoat, absorbing their cruelty and financing their luxurious lives. But that miserable era was officially over. I was finally free, and they were finally going to pay for everything they had done to me. The terminal was quiet for a brief moment after I ended the call. The finality of the disconnected video feed hung heavily over the boarding area. My sister Courtney stood completely frozen, staring at the blank screen of her phone, as if she were mourning the sudden death of her entire privileged existence. Terrence remained totally paralyzed, staring down at the corporate merger document that had just sealed his fate. But my cheating husband Derek decided he was not ready to surrender. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and slowly pushed himself up from the airport carpet. His designer clothes were wrinkled and his hair was disheveled, but his eyes burned with a frantic, desperate kind of delusion. He was a man who had spent his entire life taking the easy way out, and his brain simply refused to process the fact that he was totally trapped. Derek looked at the shattered champagne glass on the floor and then looked at Terence. He took a deep breath, attempting to inflate his chest and reclaim some shred of his shattered masculinity. He was like a cornered animal thrashing wildly in a trap, hoping to chew off its leg just to survive. Derek stepped over his spilled luggage and grabbed Terence by the shoulder, giving him a hard shake. Terence snapped out of it. Derek barked, his voice loud and rough. "Stop looking at that piece of paper like it is the end of the world. So what if the liquid cash belonged to a private equity firm? So what if the corporate bank accounts are locked up and her parents are going bankrupt? We do not need her parents, and we do not need that specific $4 million right now. We still have the physical assets." Terence slowly raised his head, looking at Derek as if he were completely insane. But Derek was entirely caught up in his own frantic pivot. He began pacing back and forth, waving his hands wildly as he listed out his delusional backup plan. He pointed to the forged transfer documents that Courtney had dropped on the floor. "Those papers are still legally binding," Derek insisted, his voice rising in pitch. "Courtney forged her signature perfectly. Those documents transferred all of the physical property directly into our new holding company. The money might be a problem, but the real estate is absolutely ours. We are still millionaires, Terence." Derek was breathing heavily now, completely intoxicated by his own desperate rationalization. He started listing the assets loudly so everyone in the terminal could hear him. "We own the primary marital estate," he bragged, stepping closer to Terence. "That is a custom-built 5,000-square-foot modern home in one of the most exclusive gated communities in the state. That property alone is worth over $3 million on the current market. We own the 2 imported luxury sport utility vehicles sitting in the airport parking lot right now. And most importantly, we own the commercial lease for her massive downtown design studio. That space is fully furnished with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of high-end inventory and imported art. We have the physical keys, we have the titles, we have the deeds. Even if the federal agents freeze the offshore accounts, they cannot instantly seize the physical properties without a lengthy court battle. We can liquidate the house and the cars by the end of the month. We can sell the commercial lease to a competitor. We have plenty of leverage to hire the best defense attorneys in the country." Terence did not look convinced, but Derek was already turning his aggressive energy toward me. He took 3 large steps in my direction, invading my personal space once again. The tears he had shed just minutes ago were completely gone, replaced by a venomous sneer. "You thought you were so clever, Paige." He spat, his face turning red with anger. "You thought you could just hand over your company to a bunch of corporate suits and leave me with absolutely nothing. But you forgot that I made sure the residential properties and the vehicles were included in the transfer documents. I took your sanctuary. I took the roof over your head. You might have protected the cash, but you failed to protect your actual life. I am going to sell the house you designed. I am going to let Courtney drive the car you paid for. We are going to strip the copper from the walls of your precious commercial studio if we have to. You are not walking away from this as the winner. You are still going to lose everything that actually matters to you." Derek leaned in closer, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "You are going to be completely homeless by midnight tonight," he threatened, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The locks on the house have already been changed. The security codes have been wiped. When you leave this airport, you will have nowhere to go. You will be sleeping on a dirty couch in a cheap hotel, while Courtney and I are sleeping in your custom king-sized bed. You are going to be a nobody, Paige, just a pathetic divorced woman who got outsmarted by her own husband and her younger sister. You are going to spend the rest of your life regretting the day you tried to cross me." I stood there and listened to his entire desperate rant. I did not flinch when he leaned into my space. I did not show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I simply looked at him with the calm, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a very stupid insect. Because Derek was so blinded by his greed and his desperate need for control that he had completely forgotten one universal truth. You should never steal something unless you know exactly what is hidden inside of it. I listened to Derek paint his beautiful delusional picture of the future. He truly believed that he had checkmated me right there in the airport terminal. He thought that because he had the physical keys to a custom-built house and the paper titles to a couple of imported sport utility vehicles, he was absolutely untouchable. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of his own perceived cruelty, hoping to see me break down and beg for a place to sleep tonight. He wanted to watch me cry over the home I had designed from the ground up. But instead of crying, I just shook my head and offered him a chilling, perfectly composed smile. "You are absolutely right, Derek," I said, my voice soft and almost sympathetic. "You do hold the physical assets. You have the massive house in the gated community and the luxury cars and the commercial lease. But you are forgetting the most important rule of real estate and high-level finance. Owning the physical asset means absolutely nothing if the asset itself is completely drowning in toxic, unmanageable debt." Derek furrowed his brow, his aggressive posture faltering for a split second. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. "I paid the mortgage last month. The cars are fully financed under the joint account. I know exactly what our debt-to-income ratio is." I could not help but laugh out loud at his sheer ignorance and blind confidence. "You know the debt-to-income ratio that I specifically allowed you to see, Derek," I corrected him, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "You really thought you were the only one keeping massive life-altering secrets in our marriage? Did you honestly believe that the founder of a highly successful corporate firm would not notice when large chunks of capital started mysteriously vanishing from our personal joint checking accounts 2 whole years ago? You thought you were being so stealthy, making small withdrawals and transferring them to those dummy accounts you set up. But I noticed the very first missing $1,000. I just chose not to confront you about it. Instead, I quietly hired one of the most ruthless forensic accountants in the city to follow your hidden digital footprints." I watched the color completely drain from Derek's face as the realization hit him. "For 2 entire years, my accountant has been tracking your every single financial move. Derek," I continued, my voice steady and methodical. "At first, I thought you were simply spending the money on Courtney. I thought it was just standard infidelity. But the comprehensive financial audit revealed something much darker and much more pathetic. You were not just a cheating husband. You were a severe, reckless gambling addict. You were bleeding money at an astonishing, terrifying rate. I have a massive digital file containing every single lost bet you ever placed on offshore sports betting syndicates. I tracked every desperate weekend trip you took to out-of-state casinos under the guise of attending mandatory business seminars. I know all about the high-stakes poker games you lost in underground hotel rooms. My team watched you drain your personal savings and then start siphoning funds from your own retirement accounts just to cover your daily losses. You were so desperate to chase your bad bets that you completely lost touch with reality." Terrence was staring at Derek with a look of absolute disgust and dawning horror. "You have been gambling?" Terrence asked, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "You told me your liquidity issues were because Paige was financially abusing you. You told me she was withholding capital from you. You lied to me, you pathetic idiot." Derek tried to back away from Terrence, holding his hands up defensively. "It was just a bad streak," Derek stammered, sweating profusely under the terminal lights. "I was going to win it all back. I just needed a little more time and a little more capital to balance the books." I turned my attention back to Derek, refusing to let him off the hook for a single second. "You were never going to win it back, Derek," I said, cutting through his pathetic, desperate excuses. "You were in an unrecoverable death spiral. By the time you went to Terrence to help you steal from my company, your hidden offshore debts had ballooned to a staggering $1.5 million. You were desperate because those unregulated lenders were starting to call your personal cell phone and threaten you. You thought you were hiding it all behind encrypted applications and secure web browsers, but my team traced every single IP address back to your personal devices. You needed a massive infusion of cash just to keep those angry creditors from showing up at our front door and breaking your legs. But here is the truly brilliant part of your catastrophic stupidity. I continued, taking another step forward, so I was the absolute center of attention. When you realized you could not get approved for any more unsecured personal loans, you started using our joint physical assets as collateral. You secretly leveraged the equity in the custom-built 5,000 square foot modern home. You put secondary liens on the imported luxury sport utility vehicles. Every single physical asset you just proudly bragged about owning is completely infected by your massive gambling debt. The house is not a sanctuary, Derek. It is a ticking time bomb. The cars are not luxury rides. They are collateral waiting to be repossessed by furious debt collectors. You completely ruined the very structural foundation you thought would keep you safe. The lenders have already begun filing the preliminary paperwork to seize the estate and freeze the accounts connected to those titles. You literally handed Courtney the legal keys to a massive burning building today. You did not steal a fortune today, Derek. You just stole your own financial execution. I watched Derek process the magnitude of his own stupidity. He looked like a man who had just discovered the parachute he packed was actually filled with heavy rocks. For months, he had secretly leveraged our life together, placing toxic secondary liens on our custom-built home and our luxury vehicles to fund his underground gambling addiction. He thought he could just forge my signature, steal the equity, and walk away, leaving me holding the bag for his financial ruin. But he severely underestimated my ability to read a balance sheet, and he completely underestimated the ruthless efficiency of my corporate legal team. When my forensic accountant first uncovered the massive mountain of debt Derek was hiding, I did not confront him. I did not file for divorce right away because doing so would have meant splitting the marital assets and the marital debts right down the middle in family court. I would have been legally forced to pay off half of his gambling markers just because we were married. I refused to let his pathetic addiction drain my hard-earned wealth. So I instructed my lawyers to construct a very specific, very quiet legal firewall. I turned my attention to my sister, who was now trembling so violently she had to lean against the boarding desk just to remain standing. "You see, Courtney?" I explained, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any sympathy. When Terrence drafted those transfer documents, he used a standard corporate template. He assumed the physical assets, the house, the cars, and the commercial lease were free and clear. He assumed he was just transferring clean titles into your new joint limited liability company. But my lawyers had already restructured the ownership of those specific assets weeks ago. We legally attached every single one of Derek's high-interest unsecured personal loans and offshore gambling markers directly to the titles of those physical properties. They were no longer standalone assets. They were packaged liabilities. When you forged my signature on those transfer papers this morning, you did not just steal the keys to a mansion. You legally and permanently adopted every single penny of Derek's catastrophic financial debt. By putting your name on that dotted line, you explicitly agreed to assume full unmitigated liability for the $1.5 million he owes to some very angry, very dangerous creditors. Terrence's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. As a senior investment banker, he understood exactly what I was saying better than anyone else in the room. He understood the absolute permanence of a signed liability transfer. "You put the debt into the limited liability company," he whispered, his voice cracking completely, losing the deep authoritative baritone he had weaponized against me earlier. "You poisoned the assets before we took them." I smiled and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. "Exactly, Terrence," I said, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction wash over me. "You built a beautiful, perfectly insulated offshore holding company to hide stolen money. But because the money you tried to steal belonged to Apex Holdings, the accounts were immediately frozen. The only things that actually successfully transferred into your shiny new company were the physical assets. And because those assets were legally bound to Derek's gambling debts, your perfectly structured joint limited liability company is now the sole legal guarantor for $1.5 million of toxic debt. You essentially built a heavily fortified financial vault and then willingly locked yourself inside of it with a ticking bomb that is about to explode. Derek tried to speak, but he could only let out a pathetic choking sound. He had spent the last 10 minutes bragging about how he was going to sell my house and my studio to fund his new life. Now he realized that selling those assets would not even cover half of the massive debt he had just legally dumped onto his new lover and her wealthy husband. Courtney was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as the reality of her situation finally broke through her lifelong delusion of entitlement. She had spent her entire life expecting to be handed the best of everything simply because she existed. She thought she was stealing a multi-million-dollar empire that would allow her to live in absolute luxury without ever having to work a single day in her life. Instead, she had just forged a federal document to steal a mountain of crippling debt. "Terrence, you have to fix this!" Courtney screamed, grabbing her husband's arm and shaking him violently. "You are a banker. You have to reverse the paperwork. Tell the bank we did not mean to take the debt. Tell them it was a massive mistake. Cancel the holding company right now." But Terrence just slowly pulled his arm away from her grasp, looking at her with an expression of pure disgust and absolute defeat. He could not fix it. There was no magic corporate loophole to reverse a forged document that had already been filed and processed across international lines. "You cannot cancel it, Courtney," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow to her fragile reality. "You signed a binding legal contract transferring the liability to your own company. The creditors do not care that you did not read the fine print, and they certainly do not care that you forged my name to get it. They only care that they now have a massive legally verified corporate entity to sue for their money. Terrence's investment banking wages will be garnished. Your personal bank accounts will be seized. They will liquidate your cars, your jewelry, and the imported clothes you are wearing right now just to cover the interest on Derek's bad bets. You wanted to take my place so badly, little sister. You wanted to own everything that belonged to me. Well, congratulations. You finally got exactly what you wanted. You own his mess now, and I am walking away completely debt-free." The gravity of my final revelation hung heavily in the fluorescent lighting of the airport terminal. I stood back and watched the absolute destruction of the villainous alliance unfold right before my eyes. Terrence, the man who had strutted into this boarding area like an untouchable corporate titan, was physically shaking. His pristine, custom-tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a broken man. He slowly turned his head away from me and looked at his wife. The profound disgust etched into his features was so intense it almost radiated heat. For the past hour, he had been operating under the arrogant assumption that he was the mastermind of a flawless financial heist. He thought he was outsmarting a naive interior designer to secure millions of dollars for his perfect marriage. But the truth had just violently shattered his reality. He realized that his beautiful, spoiled wife and her pathetic, cheating lover had not just asked for his help, they had actively dragged his immaculate investment banking career, his flawless reputation, and his entire personal fortune into a catastrophic black hole of federal fraud and toxic, unregulated gambling debt. The perfect crime was a complete, total, unmitigated illusion. The heavy silence finally broke when Terrence let out a loud roar of pure, unadulterated fury. It was a guttural, terrifying sound that completely shattered his polished country club persona. "You stupid, arrogant little girl!" he screamed, stepping aggressively toward Courtney. His deep voice echoed off the high ceilings of the concourse, causing several more passengers to stop walking and stare at our group. "You forged her signature without reading a single page of the asset history. You signed my name and your name onto a limited liability company that is completely infected with $1.5 million of dangerous gambling debt." Courtney shrank back against the ticketing counter, her blue eyes wide with sheer terror. She held her trembling hands up defensively, hot, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "Terrence, please," she sobbed hysterically, her voice cracking under the intense emotional pressure. "I did not know anything about his massive debts. Derek told me the huge house was fully paid off. Derek told me it was just free money waiting for us. I only did exactly what you told me to do today. I only signed the blank legal papers you directly handed to me blindly today." But Terrence was completely unhinged now, entirely beyond the point of any rational conversation. He did not care that they were standing in a highly public place. He did not care about the security officers who were slowly moving closer to our gate. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at her face. "I told you to sign those papers for clean, profitable assets," he roared, his chest heaving. "I risked my entire federal banking license for you. I risked 60 years in a maximum security penitentiary because you came crying to me that you desperately deserved a much better life. And you were sleeping with this pathetic loser the entire time. You permanently tied my clean financial portfolio to a broke gambling addict." Terrence abruptly spun around and directed his absolute blinding rage toward Derek. Derek was still kneeling on the carpet, looking like a whipped dog. But Terrence's sudden aggressive movement made him scramble backward in pure physical panic. "You miserable, pathetic, cowardly parasite." Terrence spat viciously, kicking one of Derek's expensive designer suitcases entirely across the floor. The heavy black bag skidded wildly and crashed loudly into a long row of metal waiting room chairs very violently. "You came into my beautiful house drinking my expensive scotch, and you looked me dead in the eye and told me Paige was bleeding your personal accounts completely dry," Terrence yelled, pointing an accusatory finger. "You swore to me. You desperately needed a financial exit strategy because she was a terrible, abusive wife. But you were just a sick, degenerate gambler, drowning in your own pathetic, stupid mistakes. You used my trusting wife to forge a federal corporate document just so you could quietly dump your toxic underground debt directly onto my immaculate credit score." Derek held both his hands up over his face, fully expecting the towering investment banker to physically strike him right there. "Terrence, I swear I was going to pay every single penny back," Derek pleaded, his voice reduced to a high-pitched nasal whine. "The house still has some equity left inside of it. We can just quickly sell the house today and pay off the angry offshore markers. We can fix this massive problem together, Terrence." "There is absolutely no fixing this, you delusional idiot." Terrence screamed, his dark facial veins visibly bulging and throbbing furiously against the sides of his sweaty forehead. "Today, the massive amount of money you recklessly stole from that corporate account triggered an immediate federal wire fraud investigation. The federal agents are probably raiding my corner office right now. The bank is going to instantly freeze my assets. The ruthless creditors are going to seize my property, and I am going to lose my professional license forever. You did not just ruin your own miserable life, Derek. You utterly ruined my life. You ruined absolutely everything. I spent 15 years tirelessly building." Courtney desperately reached out and grabbed Terrence's suit jacket, clinging to the expensive wool fabric, like a drowning woman fighting for air. "Terrence, please do not yell at him." She begged, her lifelong instinct to protect Derek, completely overriding her common sense. "We truly love each other. We can figure this terrible situation out together. You just need to calmly call your corporate lawyers to save us." Terrence looked down at his wife as if she were a toxic parasite. He violently ripped her trembling hands completely off his ruined expensive suit jacket. "There is absolutely no us anymore, Courtney," he snarled viciously. "I am officially divorcing you right now, forever and completely without any hesitation today." The terminal was suffocating under the immense weight of Terrence's furious declaration of divorce, but Derek simply could not accept the harsh reality. He had just lost his wife, his house, his money, and now the wealthy brother-in-law he desperately relied upon was washing his hands of him. The fragile ego that had driven Derek to cheat and steal finally shattered under the intense public humiliation. He could not stand there and let Terrence scream at him in front of strangers. Derek lunged forward, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, desperate rage. He shoved Terrence hard in the center of his chest using both of his hands. The sudden physical contact shocked the investment banker, who stumbled backward a few steps, his leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Terrence was not used to being physically challenged. He spent his entire life in corporate boardrooms intimidating people with his massive wealth and booming voice. The sudden physical assault from a man he considered pathetic instantly triggered a violent, aggressive response. Terrence regained his balance, his eyes wide with unrestrained primal fury. He did not say another word. Instead, he tightened his grip on the thick handle of his heavy leather briefcase. This briefcase was packed solid with heavy corporate laptops, financial dossiers, and dense power banks. He swung the briefcase through the air with the full force of his muscular frame, aiming directly at Derek's head. The heavy leather bag slammed brutally into the side of Derek's face and shoulder with a sickening, loud thud. Derek let out a sharp cry of pain as the sheer momentum of the heavy briefcase knocked him off his feet. He crashed backward into the boarding area, seating entirely destroying a row of metal chairs and knocking over a heavy plastic trash can. Half-empty coffee cups, sticky soda, and crumpled food wrappers exploded all over his designer travel clothes. Courtney let out an ear-piercing, hysterical scream. She dropped her designer handbag and covered her face with both of her hands, backing away from the two men in absolute terror. The surrounding passengers who had been quietly filming the argument immediately scattered in sheer panic. Mothers grabbed their children and sprinted away from the gate. Business travelers dove behind the ticketing counters seeking cover from the sudden brawl. Derek scrambled in the trash and spilled coffee, desperately trying to get back on his feet, his nose bleeding profusely from the impact. He blindly grabbed the collar of Terrence's custom suit, attempting to pull the larger man down to the floor with him. Terrence roared in anger and began throwing heavy punches at Derek's midsection. The two men who had just conspired to steal millions of dollars and live a life of luxury were now rolling around on the filthy airport carpet, brawling like wild animals over a pile of spilled garbage. But their violent fight was destined to be incredibly short-lived. The airline gate agent had flagged their stolen boarding passes for severe payment fraud over 20 minutes ago. The airport security teams and local police department had been quietly monitoring our gate, waiting for the right moment to approach. The sudden outbreak of physical violence was the exact catalyst they needed. Suddenly, loud, booming voices of law enforcement drowned out the screaming passengers. Over a dozen heavily armed airport police officers and federal transportation security agents sprinted rapidly down the main concourse. Their heavy tactical boots pounded against the floor, shaking the ground as they aggressively converged on Gate D4. "Get down on the ground right now!" an officer screamed, pointing a heavy black stun gun directly at Terrence's chest. "Drop the bag and put your hands behind your back immediately." Terrence, completely blinded by his furious rage, hesitated for a fraction of a second. He tried to shake Derek off his ruined suit jacket. That brief moment of hesitation was all the highly trained officers needed. Three large tactical officers hit Terrence at the exact same time, tackling the massive investment banker to the ground. His heavy designer briefcase went flying across the terminal floor, sliding all the way to my feet. Two other officers grabbed Derek by his shoulders, violently slamming him face first into the carpet, right next to a spilled cup of hot coffee. The officers moved with kinetic speed and aggressive precision, shouting loud, overlapping commands that echoed throughout the terminal. "Stop resisting," an officer yelled, pressing his knee into the center of Terrence's back. "Stop moving your hands. Put your hands behind your back." Terrence gasped for air, his face pressed against the dirty floor, his pristine custom suit ruined and torn. "I am an investment banker," Terrence cried out, trying to assert his dominance while pinned to the ground. "I am the senior vice president. Call my high-priced lawyers. Call my corporate legal team. Do not put those on me." But the police officers did not care about his wealth or title. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting around his wrists echoed through the terminal, instantly silencing his arrogant demands. Derek was crying hysterically as another officer secured his hands behind his back, pulling him up into a humiliating kneeling position. Throughout the extremely violent ordeal, I did not move a single muscle. I did not scream. I did not back away. I stood perfectly still, with my designer handbag resting on my shoulder, quietly observing the beautiful destruction I had flawlessly orchestrated. The sheer kinetic energy of the physical takedown swirled around me, but I remained anchored in a state of freezing calm. Courtney was sobbing violently against the wall, completely ignored by the swarming police officers. I looked down at the two men who had tried to leave me with absolutely nothing. They were handcuffed, bruised, bleeding, and completely humiliated in front of hundreds of strangers. I had not thrown a single punch. I had not raised my voice once. I simply told them the absolute truth and watched them utterly destroy themselves. The chaotic energy in the airport terminal slowly began to settle into a tense, heavy silence as the local police officers completely secured the boarding area. Derek was still pressed face down into the filthy carpet, whimpering softly as an officer kept a firm knee planted squarely between his shoulder blades. His expensive designer travel clothes were soaked in spilled coffee and covered in the sticky residue of discarded terminal trash. Just a few feet away, Terrence, the once proud and incredibly arrogant investment banker, was struggling to breathe under the weight of three heavily armed tactical officers. His custom-tailored navy blue suit, the ultimate symbol of his massive corporate wealth, was completely ruined. The fabric was torn at the shoulder, and his silk tie was twisted awkwardly around his neck. The hundreds of passengers who had scattered during the violent physical altercation were now slowly creeping back, forming a massive circle around our gate. Every single person in the crowd had their smartphone out, recording the absolute destruction of these supposedly wealthy elite individuals. Courtney was still backed up against the ticketing podium, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her perfect, luxurious life evaporate in front of a live audience. I stood perfectly still, watching the magnificent consequences of their greed unfold exactly as I had planned. The local police were just the opening act for the real devastation that was about to arrive. As the airport police began pulling Derek and Terrence up into humiliating kneeling positions, the crowd of onlookers suddenly parted to make way for two new arrivals. They were not wearing police uniforms or tactical gear. They were two tall men, dressed in impeccably tailored charcoal gray suits, crisp white shirts, and conservative silk ties. They moved with a chilling, calculated precision that instantly radiated absolute federal authority. They did not rush or shout commands. They simply walked directly through the circle of recording passengers and flashed their heavy gold badges to the local police captain. They were special agents from the Federal Corporate Fraud Division, and they looked like grim reapers sent straight from the Department of Justice. The lead agent, a man with cold, piercing eyes and a perfectly groomed haircut, looked down at Terrence with an expression of pure, clinical disgust. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of heavily redacted legal documents that looked identical to the trap I had sprung earlier. The agent calmly announced that they were taking immediate jurisdiction over the suspects on behalf of the federal government and the Corporate Espionage Division. He stated loudly, so the entire crowd could hear, that they were executing a federal arrest warrant for massive international wire fraud and the illegal embezzlement of $4 million from the corporate treasury of Apex Holdings. Terrence heard the federal agents reading the charges, and his survival instincts kicked in one final pathetic time. He desperately tried to leverage the only thing he had left, which was his professional title. He twisted his body, fighting against the grip of the police officers holding his arms, and looked up at the two men in the crisp gray suits. "Listen to me," Terrence pleaded, his voice cracking as he tried to project his usual corporate authority from his humiliating position on his knees. "I am a senior vice president of investment banking. I hold a top-tier federal fiduciary license. You cannot just arrest me like a common street criminal in the middle of a public airport. There has been a massive misunderstanding regarding a marital asset transfer. I have the authority to reverse the wire transaction right now. Let me stand up and I will personally call the executives at Apex Holdings. I know their board members. I can fix this entire financial discrepancy before the market closes today. Just take these restraints off me and let me access my secure banking terminal. He was speaking to them as if they were his colleagues negotiating a simple corporate merger instead of federal agents standing over him with handcuffs. He genuinely believed that his wealth and his status made him immune to the physical reality of a federal arrest. The lead federal agent did not even blink at Terrence's desperate attempt to negotiate his way out of a felony. He simply looked down at the kneeling man and shook his head with profound pity. "You do not understand your situation at all," the agent replied, his voice carrying a cold, devastating finality. Apex Holdings did not just file a simple police report today. Their internal cybersecurity division tracked the exact IP addresses of the fraudulent wire transfers. They traced the digital fingerprints directly to the private banking laptop sitting inside your ruined briefcase right there on the floor. We already have the physical evidence we need to guarantee your conviction. And as for your precious corporate status, the agent continued, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to Terrence. You are no longer a senior vice president of anything. Your federal banking license was officially suspended and fully revoked exactly 1 hour ago when the grand jury signed this arrest warrant. Your firm has already publicly terminated your employment and frozen your entire retirement portfolio to comply with the federal investigation. You have absolutely no authority, no license, and no leverage. You are just a disgraced criminal who made the incredibly stupid decision to steal operational capital from one of the most ruthless financial conglomerates on the planet. The lead agent gave a sharp nod to the local officers. The heavy steel handcuffs were aggressively deployed, clicking tightly around Terrence's wrists with a loud, unmistakable finality that echoed across the quiet terminal. Derek sobbed pathetically on the floor next to him, already completely restrained. The brilliant, arrogant mastermind and his cowardly accomplice were now entirely broken, paraded like humiliated trophies in front of hundreds of flashing cell phone cameras. The absolute destruction of their pathetic, privileged lives was now officially complete. The heavy steel handcuffs locked around Terrence's wrists, with a finality that completely silenced the boarding area. The federal agents hauled the massive investment banker to his feet, treating him exactly like the common criminal he had just proven himself to be. He did not look at me. He just stared at the floor, his pristine corporate arrogance completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. But while Terrence had the basic common sense to accept his absolute defeat, my sister and my husband were still desperately clinging to the pathetic hope that I would somehow save them from the consequences of their own actions. The local airport police officers had secured Courtney with heavy plastic zip ties, pulling her arms tightly behind her back. The physical restraint finally broke the last remaining shred of her golden child delusion. She was no longer a spoiled princess immune to the rules of the real world. She was a federal suspect standing in the middle of a massive crowd of recording onlookers. Courtney fell to her knees, right next to Derek, her designer silk blouse tearing slightly at the shoulder as she struggled against the plastic restraints. She looked up at me with mascara running down her face in thick, dark streaks. "Paige, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking violently as she frantically tried to make eye contact with me. "Please do not let them take me away. You are my big sister. You are supposed to protect me. Just tell the federal agents that this is all a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we had permission to move the money and that it is just a silly family dispute. I will never speak to Derek again. I will annul the marriage to Terrence. I will do whatever you want me to do. Just please tell them to take these plastic ties off my wrists. I cannot go to a federal prison, Paige. I am not built for a place like that. I will not survive. Please find it in your heart to forgive me. I am so sorry for everything." She was weaponizing the very sibling bond she had spent her entire life completely disrespecting. She wanted me to feel sorry for her simply because we shared the same parents. But I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the woman crying at my feet. I knew she was not crying because she felt genuine remorse for trying to steal my entire life and leave me absolutely destitute. She was only crying because her brilliant plan had catastrophically failed, and she was finally being held accountable for the very first time in her 31 years of existence. Derek, seeing that Courtney was desperately trying to play the family card, decided to attempt his own pathetic manipulation. He was still kneeling in the puddle of spilled coffee and terminal trash, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. He looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, trying to project the image of a helpless victim. "Paige, sweetheart, please listen to me," Derek begged, his voice trembling with a sickeningly sweet desperation. "I never actually wanted to hurt you. I was brainwashed. Terrence and Courtney manipulated me into doing this. They told me you were planning to leave me with absolutely nothing, so I panicked. I was scared and confused, and they took complete advantage of my vulnerable state. You know I am not a financial mastermind. I did not understand the federal documents they were making me sign. I still love you, Paige. I have always loved you. We can go to marriage counseling. We can fix our relationship. Just tell the police I was a victim of their corporate scheme. Please do not let them lock me away in a cage. I am your husband. You took a vow to stand by my side for better or for worse." I looked down at the two of them kneeling side by side in the filthy airport carpet. They were the two people I had trusted most in this world, and they had conspired to absolutely destroy me. They had mocked my dedication to my career, they had insulted my character, and they had gleefully planned to leave me bankrupt and homeless. And now, when the trap they built for me had violently snapped shut on their own necks, they were begging for my empathy. They wanted the soft, forgiving Paige to magically reappear and shield them from the devastating federal storm they had summoned. But the soft, forgiving Paige died the exact second I heard them laughing about my financial ruin behind that marble pillar. I looked at Derek, and then I looked at Courtney, feeling nothing but absolute ice flowing through my veins. The crowd of passengers watched in complete silence, waiting to see if I would show mercy to my sobbing family members. The federal agents stood nearby, holding Terrence tightly, patiently, allowing me to have the final word before they hauled the three criminals away to the processing center. I did not yell at them. I did not offer a long, emotional speech about how badly they had broken my heart. They did not deserve any more of my precious time or my energy. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us, until I was standing directly over them. I looked down into their terrified, bloodshot eyes, ensuring they saw the absolute permanent emptiness in my gaze. I slowly leaned forward, bending at the waist, so my face was just inches away from theirs. The smell of stale coffee and pure fear radiated off their ruined clothes. "Have a great trip," I whispered, my voice perfectly smooth and entirely devoid of any human emotion. I stood back up and smoothly adjusted the leather strap of my luxury designer handbag on my shoulder. I turned my back on my cheating husband, my treacherous sister, and the arrogant investment banker who had tried to ruin my life. I did not look back a single time as I confidently walked away down the long, brightly lit terminal, leaving them to face the absolute destruction of their own making. I let the sound of Courtney's hysterical wailing fade into the background noise of the busy airport. The rhythmic clicking of my designer heels on the polished terrazzo floor sounded like the absolute ultimate victory march. I had walked into this airport expecting to confront a painful personal betrayal, but I was walking out as an entirely liberated woman. I had completely amputated the toxic, infected limbs of my life, and I had never felt so incredibly light. My future was entirely my own again, unburdened by their endless greed and their pathetic lies. Exactly 3 months have passed since that spectacular afternoon at the airport terminal, and the profound silence in my life has been absolutely beautiful. The massive federal investigation moved with a terrifying, ruthless speed that completely decimated the pathetic lives of the people who tried to destroy me. The legal system did not care about the tears Courtney cried or the desperate pleas Derek made for mercy, and it certainly did not care about the arrogant wealth my parents used to flaunt. The absolute destruction they brought upon themselves was a masterpiece of poetic justice, and watching the entire fallout has been incredibly satisfying from start to finish. Let us start with Derek. My former husband, the man who thought he could steal my company to fund his secret underground gambling addiction, quickly realized that federal prosecutors do not offer second chances to anyone. When the corporate lawyers from Apex Holdings finished handing over their massive files of digital evidence, the judge did not show a single ounce of leniency. Derek pled guilty, hoping for a reduced sentence, but the sheer magnitude of the wire fraud, combined with his massive, unregulated debt, entirely secured his fate. Last week, a federal judge sentenced Derek to 8 full years in a maximum security penitentiary. He traded our beautiful custom-built home for a tiny concrete cell. The luxury cars he bragged about owning were immediately repossessed by his angry creditors right out of the airport parking lot. He will spend the remainder of his 30s wearing a standard-issue uniform, completely stripped of the lavish lifestyle he felt so entitled to steal. Terrence, the supposed financial genius who believed he was an untouchable apex predator, faced an equally devastating reality. The very first thing he did when he was released on bail was file for an immediate emergency divorce from Courtney. He completely abandoned his beautiful golden child wife, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. He desperately tried to throw Derek and Courtney under the bus, hoping to negotiate a plea deal with the federal government to save his own skin. But the corporate espionage agents already had all the digital fingerprints they needed from his private banking laptop. The high-priced legal team Terrence hired could not save him from the absolute truth of his actions. He was formally indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud and conspiracy. His prestigious investment banking license was permanently revoked, and his massive personal assets were frozen by the federal court. He went from being a senior vice president to a completely disgraced criminal, waiting for his inevitable trial. As for my precious younger sister Courtney, the harsh reality of the real world finally came crashing down on her fragile shoulders. Without the massive income Terrence provided to fund her endless shopping sprees and luxury vacations, she was left completely destitute. She is currently facing her own serious federal conspiracy charges for forging my signature on those corporate transfer documents. Because Terrence froze all of their joint accounts during the divorce proceedings, she could not even afford to hire a decent defense attorney. She had to swallow her massive pride and beg for a court-appointed public defender. The woman who once stood in an airport terminal wearing designer silk and mocking my dedication to my career is now entirely penniless. With nowhere else to go, Courtney was forced to crawl back to our parents. But Richard and Brenda were in no position to rescue their favorite daughter. The bank followed through on their foreclosure proceedings and physically evicted my parents from the beautiful colonial mansion they had lived in for decades. Their country club memberships were permanently canceled, and their wealthy friends completely abandoned them the second the scandal became public knowledge. My parents were forced to rent a cramped, downgraded 2-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood just to keep a roof over their heads. Courtney is currently living in their dark, unfinished basement, sleeping on a cheap air mattress while she awaits her federal trial. Their total financial ruin made them incredibly desperate. 2 weeks ago, Richard and Brenda actually had the sheer audacity to show up at the grand lobby of my new corporate headquarters. They bypassed the reception desk and tried to demand an audience with me, crying about how family needs to stick together during hard times. They expected me to simply hand over a massive check to save them from the miserable poverty they created for themselves. But I did not even bother to come downstairs to speak with them. I simply pressed a button on my desk and watched the security camera feed as my private corporate security team physically escorted them out of the building. My lawyers immediately filed formal trespassing charges and secured a permanent restraining order against both of them. They are no longer allowed to come within 500 feet of me or my business ever again. And that brings me to this exact beautiful moment. I am currently sitting in the ultra-exclusive first-class lounge at the international terminal waiting to board my flight. But this time I am not hiding behind a marble pillar watching my life fall apart. I am sipping a glass of incredibly expensive vintage champagne, watching the airplanes take off against the bright morning sky. I am flying to Paris today to officially cut the ribbon on the brand new European branch of my design firm. Apex Holdings fully funded the expansion just as they promised, and my career has skyrocketed to heights I never even dreamed were possible. I took my power back from the toxic people who tried to bury me. They thought my kindness was a weakness they could easily exploit. They thought stealing my money would completely break my spirit. But they forgot one crucial thing about me. I was the one who built the empire from the ground up. And while they are rotting in prison cells and damp basements, I am busy conquering the world. This story is a powerful reminder that family is not always defined by blood, and loyalty should never be a one-way street. For years, I allowed my parents and my sister to disrespect my boundaries, because society teaches us that we must forgive our family members, no matter how terribly they treat us. But toxic behavior does not magically become acceptable just because you share a biological connection. My parents enabled a golden child dynamic that completely destroyed the ability my sister had to function in the real world. By constantly shielding her from the consequences of her actions, they did not protect her, they ruined her. The most valuable lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that your success should never be used as a weapon against you. You do not owe anyone your hard-earned wealth, your peace of mind, or your absolute sanity. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to completely walk away from the people who constantly tear you down. When you finally stop pouring your energy into a toxic family dynamic, you create a massive amount of space for genuine respect and limitless potential to enter your life. You are the architect of your own future, and you hold the absolute power to lock the door behind you. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to protect your own peace and sanity? How did you find the incredible strength to finally enforce your personal boundaries? I would love to read your amazing stories in the comment section below. If my journey resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of resilience and sweet revenge. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of their true worth.